How casual is Hell Let Loose? Well, in this video I will go over how the game plays, its various systems like gunplay and movement, and give it a rating out of 10. 10 being super casual and 1 being super hardcore. If you'd like me to cover any other game from any genre, chuck in a comment below, upvote any other suggestions, and subscribe for more. If you don't know what Hell Let Loose is, it's a World War II first-person shooter with 100 players. That's 2 teams of 50 fighting each other out over 2 game modes. While there are other game modes currently in development, the main game mode is Warfare. Typically games can last up to 90 minutes, or if the objective is completed by capturing the enemy's main base. Many people consider Hell Let Loose to be a hardcore shooter or even a milsim, but let's see, in my opinion, if it is. And first, we'll take a look at the new player experience, because I believe the new player experience, when it comes to generally any game, especially games that consider themselves more hardcore or tactical, it's quite key to introduce new players into that game, its systems and how it plays, to get those players in and at least have a baseline of knowledge of how the game plays. So what's the new player experience like in Hell Let Loose? Well, it does have an optional training mode or a practice range that you can play on, and it also has an in-game manual. Instead of back in the old days where you would buy a physical copy of the game and you'd get a manual to read through, this game does have a version of that in-game, which is nice to read through, but I don't think people really use the field manual. And I remember back in the early days of Hell Let Loose, the field manual would actually contain out-of-date information. It's a nice thing to have, but I don't really think people will read through manuals anymore, and I do believe having a playable new player experience is better than just something to read through. But onto the practice range or the training mode for Hell Let Loose. Currently it's a US only faction training mode, because in the game there are multiple factions. There's the US, Soviets, Germans, and the British. And in this training mode you can shoot the US faction weapons, drive some of their vehicles, shoot with tanks, build the OP or garrison, which is basically the spawn points in the game, and there are some text pop-ups throughout this training mode to give you some extra information about what you're doing. It is a pretty unguided mode, it's just like a map it spawns you in and you can run around and do this stuff in. While it's a good thing to have, I don't think the current new player experience in Hell Let Loose is good enough to introduce new players into the game. Yes, you can run around and shoot and drive and do stuff, but it doesn't really give you core information to show you or tell you how to play the game effectively. I know that the new player experience is still being worked on in Hell Let Loose, so this should improve down the line. Now let's talk about gunplay, and first, time to kill. And when it comes to casual shooters, I would consider time to kill being very high, meaning it's going to take a lot of shots to kill someone. If you look at something like Battlefield or Call of Duty, generally in those games they do have a longer time to kill because they are more casual, and when it comes to headshots in those games, if you're not using a sniper rifle or a shotgun, it will take multiple headshots to kill someone, and in hardcore games, the time to kill is going to be very, very low, taking one shot maybe in some games, or just a couple of shots. Now in Hell Let Loose, it's going to take really 1 to 3 shots to kill someone, depending on what weapon you use, and a headshot with any weapon at any range is a 1-shot kill. So I would consider the time to kill in Hell Let Loose to be something associated with a hardcore game. But something that is kind of a bit strange with Hell Let Loose, and for me I would consider something more towards like a casual game, is how the game handles its various weapons. Now all weapons in Hell Let Loose fall into certain groups. You have rifles, which will be something like an M1 Garand, SVT-40, Kar 98K or Lee Enfield, the submachine guns, Sten, MP40, Thompson, sniper rifles like a Kar 98 with a scope on it, and what I would consider or call in game as automatic rifles, STG-44, BAR, even though they may not technically be classed as automatic rifles. It's just a grouping based around a certain role in the game. Now every weapon in every group does the exact same damage as the other weapons in the group. So if you look at rifles, the M1 Garand does the exact same damage as the Kar 98, a Lee Enfield, and so on, which for rifles is a one-shot kill to the chest up to 200 meters and 2 shots above 200 meters. SMGs are 2 shots to kill up to 75 meters, and above that are 3 shots to kill. And automatic rifles, they are 1 shot to kill up to 100 meters and 2 shots after. The only real difference between the weapons in their specific grouping is rate of fire and recoil. Now, if you was going to put the M1 Garand next to the SVT-40, both weapons that are, I believe, self-loading rifles, so they're kind of like semi-automatic rifles, you could say, they will be extremely different in terms of bullet velocity and penetration values and other stuff. I'm not a weapons guy, so I don't really know the technical details, but they will be different. And if you put something like an MP40 next to a Thompson, they will be very different in terms of like their stopping power, you could say. So when it comes to Hell Let Loose putting these weapons into just groups where they do the exact same damage, to me that's a very casual implementation, and I haven't seen any game that does that apart from Hell Let Loose. Even something like Fortnite, I think anyway, has different values and different damage and different ranges for all their weapons, like especially when you consider like automatic rifles or assault rifles in Fortnite. I think they'll fall under, they will be very different from each other, I think anyway. Even looking at something like Call of Duty or Battlefield, every weapon has various stats. Even though they're slightly different, they're still different. So it means there's more information to take in and more really to learn about the weapons in these other games compared to Hell Let Loose. Ammo management is something that also separates casual and hardcore first-person shooters. Generally, I would say in hardcore games, you manage your magazines, right? If you have an M4, you have a magazine that has 30 bullets in it. You put that magazine in, you shoot 15 bullets, you take that magazine out, it's got 15 bullets left in it, or rounds I guess you could say. Then you put that into your vest. Later you could grab that same magazine and clip it back in, and it's still only going to have 15 rounds left in it. But in casual shooters, you don't have magazines, you just have rounds, and whenever you reload, you put in a fresh magazine every time because it just magically fills up with the bullets or rounds you have in your inventory. That's how casual shooters work. An example of a real hardcore shooter I would consider would be something like Tarkov, where you do have individual magazines with individual rounds that you have to load into your magazine to then put into your weapon, or something like Squad, where you do have individual magazines and you keep those with you, and yeah, you can put those back in and they keep the ammo count in them. Now in Hell Let Loose, it's a bit deceptive of how it handles ammo. In the bottom right corner of your screen, it will tell you how many magazines or clips you have left for your weapon, but when you reload it, it doesn't use like a fresh magazine. It does actually use the casual magically fill in round magazine from something like Call of Duty or Battlefield. What I think the game should do is change how it displays your ammo from the amount of magazines or clips you have to purely how many rounds you have, because that's the system it's using in game, unless they change it to actually use the magazines you have, so you'll have to actually manage your ammo and your shooting a bit more. And lastly, for Gunplay, let's talk about recoil. Now in casual shooters, I think it's fair to say that you'll have very low recoil or a bloom system. If you don't know what bloom is, basically if you're aiming down the sights of your weapon and you start shooting, the bullets will randomly deviate around where you're aiming. They won't actually go where you are aiming, right, if that makes sense. A lot of third-person shooters use bloom because it's a third-person shooter and that's just how it works. If you look at Fortnite and someone's shooting full auto, the recoil will go up, but you'll see the bullets going around where you're aiming. That's bloom. Now in Hell Let Loose, it doesn't use bloom at all. When you ADS, the bullets will go where you're aiming and the recoil is quite high. Should also mention that the game does have a ballistic system where the bullets will actually drop after 100 meters, and There is a penetration system where your bullets, based on what type of weapon you're using, can penetrate certain types of cover. But yeah, the recoil is generally quite high in Hell Let Loose, meaning that it can be difficult to control unless you get some practice in, but if you do practice, it is pretty controllable. But putting it up against something like Call of Duty or Battlefield, I would consider it to be a definitely more hardcore recoil management system than those games. So when it comes to gunplay in Hell Let Loose, I think it's quite obvious that it uses a mixture of hardcore and casual elements. It has quite a hardcore time to kill, a casual implementation of its weapon groups when it comes to the damage, a casual implementation of an ammo management system, but a more hardcore recoil. Now, Hell Let Loose uses a commander system in its game, and the commander system is on each team, one player can be the commander, and that player now has access to a voice chat channel with all the other squad leaders in the game, and specific commander abilities to spawn in fresh tanks, call in bombing runs, call in other sort of abilities like ammo drops and supply drops. And it's a feature that, in my opinion, is generally only available in the more hardcore games. You can consider Squad like more of a hardcore shooter, and that has a commander system, so does Squad 44. But then if you look at the original Battlefield 2, that also had a commander system, but Battlefield has kind of scrapped the commander system going forward from that point. And I would consider any game that really has a commander style system in it, where you have this one player that's generally in charge of the entire team, or at least trying to guide the entire team, to be a more hardcore game, because it's like trying to emulate, or sort of trying to emulate, like a real battle where you would have this one guy who's generally in command of everything. And the game also has a command structure where, like I said earlier, there are squad leaders where the commander can speak to, and everyone has to join a squad to actually play the game and choose a role and choose a loadout. And when you do choose your role and your loadout, you will find that roles are restricted. In each squad, you are restricted to what types of roles you can choose. Now, there's the rifleman role, which everyone can choose. You know, it doesn't matter how many riflemen you have in a squad. But if you look at something at, well, every other role, assault, medic, anti-tank, engineer, for example, only one person can choose that role. You can't have 5 anti-tank guys in a squad. You can't have 3 engineers. You can only have the one. Now, this sort of restricted class system, I would consider, again, a feature of a more hardcore style game, because what it's trying to do is get that squad to stay together, choose certain roles to fulfill certain things they need to do, and work together really to support each other. You need your anti-tank guy to take out the tank, so maybe you get a support guy who can resupply explosive ammo to the anti-tank guy to be able to take out more tanks. Maybe you should have a medic in your squad to keep your squad healed up. Maybe a machine gunner to put suppressive fire down. Maybe an engineer who can help repair tanks, put down some extra defenses, and crucially, build nodes. And what are nodes? And nodes are a sort of RTS element that's actually been built into Hell Let Loose. The engineers need supplies from the support player or the commander to build nodes. And what these nodes do is generate resources for the commander to be able to use their special abilities. If you imagine you're playing an RTS like Warcraft and you need to go get gold from the gold mine or go get wood. I'm pretty sure you get wood in Warcraft. I haven't played it in donkey's years. But it's something similar to that. But it's a very passive system. You build the node and then that's it. You forget about it. You don't need to do anything else to it. But it's something I would say, again, is a feature of a more hardcore game, because it's trying to get your team to work together to help everyone out. Get your engineer to get the node built, to get more resources for the commander so they can help out and spawn more tanks and use more abilities. Now, when it comes to tanks, generally I would say in what's considered a more casual game, let's look at Battlefield, you jump in your tank and then you can control pretty much every aspect of that tank as one guy. Drive it around, move the turret, shoot the main weapon. But in Hell Let Loose, there are multiple seats for each tank. Generally you have the driver, the gunner, and the commander. The driver drives, the gunner shoots the main turret, and the commander can pretty much use a 360-degree view to spot enemies and pretty much give out orders. Again, it's trying to emulate like a real life situation. You won't just have one guy in a tank doing everything by himself. It's a complex machine that requires multiple people. So it's a pretty hardcore representation of a tank, I would say. And tanks in Hell Let Loose, they do have various weak points. Usually it's just the rear, which you'll consider the weakest point of the tank. If you try to shoot a tank in its front armor, depending on what tank you're using, it could just deflect around and do 0 damage. I would say in casual games, tanks wouldn't have a weak point at all. You just shoot the tank, no matter where you hit it, it does X amount of damage based on what tank you're using. But in Hell Let Loose, yeah, it does have various weak points. And also the tanks in Hell Let Loose have a component system. Generally the components are just the hull in general, which is the health point of the whole tank, the turret, and the tracks. If you damage the tracks, it turns really slow. If you damage the engine, it drives very slow. And if you damage the turret, it'll turn the turret slower. But with its hull component, that represents the tank's health. So you can damage the components without actually destroying the tank. You still need to take out its overall HP pool to destroy it. So it's a bit of a mixture of this hardcore and casual system, I'd say, by giving the tank a general HP loadout and these components. And there are some missing components, I would say, when it comes to Hell Let Loose. You can't shoot the tank at a very specific angle to, say, hit the ammo rack to take out the ammo rack. It doesn't work like that. It's, I would say, a bit of a mixture of a hardcore and casual system when it comes to tanks in Hell Let Loose. When it comes to movement systems for casual and hardcore games, I would say what represents a hardcore game is something that is trying to emulate real life. Something where you can't be sprinting through windows and jumping off rooftops and proning midair and spinning around like a Superman or something like in Call of Duty. In hardcore games, it's going to be a lot more grounded. You're not going to be able to do all these crazy things. Now in Hell Let Loose, I would say the movement system is very grounded. You can't do loads of like crazy sprinting and stuff. It is very boots on the ground, and it just feels like it is trying to replicate a realistic system. There is one crucial thing in Hell Let Loose that moves it away from a realistic implementation of movement to something more casual, and that's stamina. And that's quite crucial for Hell Let Loose because the maps are quite big, so you will be running around and sprinting a lot. But because there's no stamina, you can sprint from one end of the map to the other and back for the entire duration of the match and have no slowdown to your running speed at all, or have no effect really to your character at all. There is no stamina. And if you compare this to something like Squad, you do have a stamina system, and the lower your stamina is, it affects your overall sprinting speed and it affects your aiming. Your aiming will have more sway until you gain your stamina. So the movement in Hell Let Loose, like many things in Hell Let Loose, is a mix between casual and hardcore. One thing that also needs to be talked about for Hell Let Loose is the medic system. I'm not specifically talking about how healing works, because if you get injured, you use a bandage, you're good. You get set on fire, you use a bandage, and you're good. You get downed, a medic can revive you by stabbing you with some morphine, you're good. Although I would say that that specific part of the medic system is quite casual, right? What I'm talking about is the overall effect of having a medic in the game. If we look at something like Battlefield, you have a ticket system, and when your tickets get to 0, you lose the game, and the ticket system is drained by you having less capture points than the enemy, or when you respawn, you lose a ticket. So that means having a medic is extremely valuable because they can revive people, so your tickets get drained less or slower. This is also important in Squad, where you have medics to stop tickets being used up. When you respawn, you get your medics to revive you instead. But in Hell Let Loose, there is no ticket system, so dying has no real consequence on whether you lose the game or not. I mean, of course it does because there's less people fighting, but you'll find that people will kill themselves or respawn forcefully just to be able to then respawn in various different areas of the map, because dying has no effect on like this ticket system, because there is no ticket system in the game. And you will find that a lot of competitive teams, or probably every competitive team in Hell Let Loose, won't use medics in their game because they will have like a weaker loadout compared to the other roles in the game. So you would have a different role instead. Now, if you look at something like squad, well, I've never played squad competitively. I'm pretty sure that every squad will have at least one medic in it. So because the medic doesn't really have that much of an effect in game, in terms of like a ticket system, it's strange to say it's quite a casual implementation of the medic role, I would say. So, Hell Let Loose, looking at its various systems, would you say it's a hardcore game or a casual game? Now, looking at the various systems, it uses a mixture of what I would consider anyway hardcore and casual stuff, right? And I think picking Hell Let Loose as the first game in this series is quite a good starting point, really, because I would consider Hell Let Loose like a near perfect cross between a casual and a hardcore game, which is why I'm going to give Hell Let Loose a casual score of 5 out of 10. It's not really a casual game, it's not really a hardcore game, it's definitely not a milsim that many people call it, but what I think it is a near perfect starting point for anyone who wants to get out of a casual shooter into something more hardcore but without diving straight into the deep end. Start with something like Hell Let Loose because it does contain a lot of casual elements and a lot of hardcore elements. Now I'm going to be looking at other games in the future, and if you have suggestions, put them down in the comments below, join my Discord, put some suggestions in there, and let me know what you think about my casual score for Hell Let Loose. If you liked the video, give it a like, a dislike if you didn't. Thank you for watching, and subscribe for more.